Good afternoon, all. First, I'd like to thank the SAIA for the invitation to speak today on this very important industry topic that will impact every stakeholder of mobile elevating work platforms. Both the US and Canadian standards have been completely revised, and they are following an ISO-based standard. So the ISO standards for design, safe use, and training have been the foundation for the new standards in both the US and Canada. And as you will hear in the presentation, the CSA standards have adopted the ISO standards with Canadian deviations, whereas the ANSI A92 standards are actually new standards using them as a foundation. So as you look at those standards, you won't be able to compare them very easily as well. So there's going to be a lot of people who are going to have some time digesting the difference between the existing standards and the new standards because they're a completely different format. So how many people in this room actually deal with aerial work platforms at all? All right, so those of you who don't, I don't want you to feel excluded from this because I think it's important for you to really start considering some of the language that we're dealing with within these standards that may be able to be applied towards standards covering other products. So I think that you want to look at those things and say, how can we apply this elsewhere? Because when we look at the development of these standards, we look at forklift training requirements. And are they different than what we have for mobile elevated work platforms, and should they be different, or what can we include? So I would encourage you to really think about that aspect if you're not dealing directly with these products. So really, if you haven't been involved and you haven't been following this, after many years by industry experts and several offerings for public comment, if you're familiar with the process that we go through with the development of standards, the A92 suite of standards will be published this year. And the A92 standards will have a safe use, A92.22 and .24 for training, and the A92.20 standard was most recently issued for public comment, and that has just gone through its approval. So we're now at the finish line of the process, and now we're going to be looking for publication. The B354 standards have been published as of May 17th in Canada, and we're going to review some of the significant changes today in relationship to those. It took us 5 years to complete these standards, and they're completely different, so I may be a little long-winded on certain topics today, trying to take 6 standards, 3 for each of our countries, and trying to give you a summary of some of those changes. So committee members here. So Jeff, any other committee members? All right, so again, there's a lot of people who are involved in the decisions that took place in the development of these standards. We had almost 60 people on each of the subcommittees in the US, and we had a smaller group in Canada, but again, there's an awful lot of time, energy, and resources to the development of these standards. I always put in my admonition up front by saying that today's presentation is based upon draft standards. They are now finalized, but as they're coming out, the existing standards are still going to be in place. We're going to highlight some of the key changes that take place, but understand that you need to read and understand the entire standards. This is not going to give you the exclusive knowledge that you need to apply to your complete business. So if you're looking at this picture, too often operator training is perceived simply to be learning how to make a mobile elevated work platform move, and that's a incorrect assumption, and it clearly identifies a need for the industry to have standards to identify and communicate the requirements for safe use, training requirements, and ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance of the standards. And this recent photo taken from Vertical magazine, it's easy to identify with people in this room to see what the workers here should have seen. And is the lift being used as designed and recommended by the manufacturer? Is the operator trained and familiarized? Have they read and understood the operator's manual? Has a risk assessment been completed prior to the use of this equipment, and was the right equipment selected for this? Do you think that they completed their daily pre-start and workplace inspections? Are all the workers qualified to do this task? So, I mean, if you're looking at this, this is a disaster waiting to happen. And I can guarantee you that those workers all thought that they were doing the right thing. And that really speaks to the need for us to have our standards and utilize them. So both the US and Canadian standards use the same ISO standards as a framework to develop the new standards. ISO 16368 2010 was, you got to keep in mind when we were developing these standards, we used the 2010 standard that was also being updated while we were updating our standards. 18893, which is the safe use standard, is 2014, and 18878 was 2013. So all of those standards, while we're developing our standards, we're also going through their updates. So trying to keep these standards equivalent with one another and addressing the same issues and trying to bring harmonization to what our requirements are worldwide is a challenge. So the new standards have been under development for many years, and having tried to keep pace with all of those changes worldwide, as I said, has been a challenge. So today's presentation, we're going to try to address some simple goals: to identify key topics for MEWP safe use, identify changes from the existing standards, identify variances between country standards, specifically between the US and Canada, and raise industry stakeholders' awareness of pending changes and provide the opportunity to plan and prepare for compliance. It's unquestionable that MEWPs are the safest means to get people elevated safely for temporary work at height. You have a platform that can get you to the exact location, fully guardrail at all times, and it's safe provided that people do things properly. Industry standards provide the roadmap for compliance of tasks associated with manufacturing, ownership, dealers, users, operators, and included now within our standards is supervisors and occupants. We don't have MEWP policemen. So, as you're looking at over here, if someone's doing something wrong, someone has to identify and get things corrected and make sure that people are in compliance. So all entities must understand the responsibilities defined in the standards and achieve a safe and effective use for them. It is critical that all entities who are involved with MEWPs are also aware of and comply with the standards. Standard provides the norms and guidelines that define the level of quality and achievement that is considered acceptable or desirable. So again, we're going to look at those, and within the standards, especially in the US market, we put a lot of responsibilities on specific entities. While the same task and responsibilities are in both the existing and new standards, it's not going to be easy to compare the complete changes in the structure between the old and new standards. The new standards are structured around tasks, and the existing standards are by entities. So when you're looking at the US standards, there's a section for manufacturers, there's a section for operators, for users. And when you look at the new standard, it's going to be by task, and who's responsible for those will be embedded in there. So if you're a user of the equipment, you're going to have to go over and say, okay, where is the user throughout the standard? So it's a little bit different structure. So I do add that when an entity, like a dealer, is responsible for things as a dealer, they also may assume responsibilities for other positions, because a dealer may also be an owner. They also may be a user of the equipment. So an entity may have more than one responsibility. The new B354 standards are an adoption of the respective ISO design, safe use, and training standard. The screenshot will identify through what's highlighted items that need to be replaced as an ISO paragraph in the Canadian deviation. As written, it's not highlighted within the standards the way that I have it highlighted here. You're going to read a whole section, and then when you get done with it, it's going to say delete that section and replace it with this. So you need to be careful if someone's going out there and referencing the document and they go to a section and they don't read the entire item and find out that somewhere below it's replaced. So the Canadian standards as an adoption of of an ISO standard with deviations will be a little bit more of a challenge for people to ensure that they're reading and applying the right requirements. The design standard is actually the foundation for the two other standards. So the design standard sets up, this is what we're making, this is the equipment that's covered by it, and the safe use says, okay, this is how it was made, and this is what we need to do it safely, and the training standard trains you on how to apply those safe use practices. The suite of standards can accommodate all groups and types of mobile elevated work platforms, but in this particular case, keep in mind that within both the US and Canada, A92.2 and CSA 225, which are vehicle-mounted aerial work platforms, will remain as active standards and not covered by the suite of standards. So when you're looking at the opportunities of saying these things are being changed, if you have a fleet that has that product line in it, you have to be compliant with that standard in addition to these standards. So our world is becoming more of a global nature in every passing year, and we need to develop more harmonization between country standards. Using common terminology with the same definition is a critical first step. So the safe use should not be any different whether you're in Brazil, India, Quebec, or New York. Safe use is safe use, and it should be dominantly the same regardless of where you are. So while language will be different in the country you're in, the terms and definitions should be identical in meaning. Again, this is a process that we went through, so while we had an ad hoc committee, we actually developed a set of harmonized definitions that were applied throughout all of our standards. So that the language changed as well. So terminology and language within the standards should provide clear guidance on the requirements for the task that must be accomplished, but that can only result in confusion or misunderstanding if they're not adequately stated or understood. In one section, the wording may make sense, but when various terms are used in different sections, questions can arise. As an example, for many years, standards stated operating and maintenance manuals as being plural. Some assumed that there were two manuals, an operating manual and a maintenance manual. And some assumed that the maintenance manual was the service manual or repair manual, which it is not. So how many manuals do you think there is in total to be required to be provided by manufacturers? And what needs to be on that machine? Manuals are an important tool that are required to provide necessary information for MEWP owners and users. The list of terms above demonstrate how many simple terminologies can potentially be confusing. So when you're looking at all of the terms that were over there on the right, those are all the terms that were out there. And when you go over there today, we have an operations manual, and we're going to get into the definitions, an operator's manual, a parts manual, a service manual, and the manual of responsibilities. And the manual of responsibilities is attached only to the US standards. There's not one in Canada. Even with harmonization as a goal and having had several companies and individuals who sit on both the ISO standards, the Canadian standards, the US standards, so we have people who are a member of all of those, we get to the point where terminology becomes a challenge, and we still haven't got consensus even between the US and Canada on certain terms. So when you're looking at the terminology that's changed, here are some of the examples. AWPs have changed to MEWP, or it's pronounced MEWPs generally within the industry. The operator's manual is a term used only in A92. Groups and types are now going to be introduced as different to create different categories. An aerial device is used, and that's only the device that goes onto a chassis for vehicle mounted. And then you have occupants and supervisors. So here's kind of a picture of the different types of MEWP categories, trying to give you kind of a classification. We have types 1, 2 and 3, and groups A and B. A is a vertical type lift, B is a boom type lift. So when the machine is going over the chassis, that's really how you have it. So you end up having groups 1A, 1B, 3A, and 3B. There is a group 2, and the difference with group 2 is the controls when the machine is out of its stored position actually comes from the chassis rather than from the platform. So B354.1 covers both Type 1 and Type 2 aerial work platforms as defined in the standard aerial platforms, a portable elevating work platform. So when you're looking at what products used to be covered by the existing standards, a vehicle mounted was covered in the prior standards. So now when you're looking at them, you can't go over and say that A92.5 equipment, which is self-propelled booms, are all going to be a 3B, which is a self-propelled boom type equipment. Because in that standard also has equipment that's track mounted, that's drivable, but is not able to be elevated when the platform is out of the stowed position. It requires outriggers. So people are going to have to get used to this terminology, but I have to say that even today, people are out there with these different standards, and they have all different names on them. So A92.2, 0.3, 0.5, 0.6 all have different names, and most people didn't know what those terms were. They call them boom lifts, they call them scissor lifts. These are the categories that you're going to have to become somewhat fluent with as you're moving forward. So when you're looking at these as an example, here's two different types of machines, and they look similar, but they're not. One is a scissor lift type lift, and it's a Sigma, and the other one is actually a boom type lift. So while they may look alike, when you get out into the field with the people who are using this equipment, we as industry experts will know what they are, but it may not be as fluently known by those people who are using the products every day. So commonly referred to as the design standard, A92.20 and B354.6 are going to be the standards that the manufacturers will follow to be compliant with the manufacturing of machines manufactured by this new standard. Within those standards, there are some significant changes that need to take place. So if you're a manufacturer, I'm sure that you would ID some substantial changes in the design of the standards. This presentation is going to highlight the impact those changes will have on MEWP users. So as a requirement for a means to provide owners to identify that the MEWP has an annual inspection will be now required to be provided by each of the manufacturers. So while today, if you're using these lifts, there may be a decal that people are already using, some means must be on the machines. So if you're a contractor and you own the equipment, you need to make sure that you're doing your annual inspections, putting that decal on those, because it's a requirement for the operator to ensure that the machine has an annual inspection before they use it. What must be covered in familiarization? Familiarization is going over the specific characteristics and controls and safety devices on a particular machine, and that information will now be required to be put into the operator's manual, whereas that information is scattered throughout that manual today. They'll have a section on it so that someone can go over there and go through it and make sure that they're covering all the items that the manufacturer requires in familiarization. So that is an improvement in making it simpler for people to provide familiarization, and actually, if they're qualified to do so, actually self-familiarize. When the permissible overturning moment is reached, a visual warning shall be displayed, and further movement shall be prevented except those which reduce the overturning moment. So currently, if you look at it, there's a tilt control on machines in the marketplace, and those tilt controls would go over there and have a sound and a light that would go off, and people would continue to maneuver. The new standards are going to actually put a requirement in where the manufacturer will have the machine set up so it restricts ongoing travel that will make the continuation into a more dangerous situation, and they can only go into a situation where they're going to reverse the direction to improve the safe use of that machine. And then new stability test will require a maximum allowable chassis inclination plus 0.5 degrees with the platform loaded with its maximum allowable rated load, wind force, manual and special rated loads, plus the added inclination resulting from a deflated tire if supported by a pneumatic tire. That new requirement within the design criteria for the manufacturer is going to impact most equipment that is what we call rough terrain, which has a higher gradability. So by taking that machine and now deflating the tire, if you had 25% or 35% gradability and now you flatten the tire, that stability is going to increase to a higher level. And the net result of that is, in order to keep that high level of gradability on these machines, you are going to see only foam-filled tires being used within the machine. So as the manufacturing of this equipment goes out, most people are going to go and not see anything in the standard that says you must use foam-filled tires or you can't use air-filled tires. But because of this design criteria, you're going to find that these rough terrain machines are now going to be forced to use foam-filled tires to keep the existing gradability on those rough terrain machines. Since this is new and the first time many people will be exposed to platform overloading system in North America market, awareness, training, work planning will become more important. And although the rated workload should have never been exceeded in the past, it likely was, and this will create issues for users if they do not plan in advance what loads will be placed on the work platform. Equipment with load sensing devices will disable the normal elevating functions in addition to sounding an alarm when overloaded. So if you're looking at a piece of equipment today, you could go over there and it had a 500-pound rated capacity on it. You could most likely put 600-700 pounds on it in certain configurations and it would lift it. When you go and you do that on the new platforms that have load sensing on it, that machine is not going to elevate. So if you're down at the ground level, that's okay, take some of the load out and we can move up. Think about it now, I'm in the elevated position and I'm taking down an air conditioning unit and that added weight goes into it. Now I've overloaded the platform. Now the machine will not operate. It becomes a little bit more of a challenge for you because you don't want to go and have to reinstall that to take the load off the platform, and you don't want to throw the machine or one of the occupants out of the platform. So the only way that that thing can be used in that particular configuration is through the auxiliary power on the machines. So these are going to cause some changes. If you own the equipment, it's going to cause more maintenance on those to keep these things calibrated properly, and obviously add to the expense of the machines as well. But the load sensing technology has been around for many years, and while it does add some complexities and service requirements to the use, they're very successful in the markets today. The only thing I can give you as a reference point is, back in the 1970s and 80s when these things were first brought into the market, load sensing was out there, the technology was horrible, and they were not accepted in the US market. And now it's becoming a standardized component that will be mandated on all mobile elevated work platforms. Capacity. There will be many benefits in the ability to control the loads because now the manufacturers know that they can't overload these platforms. So by having that control within their design criteria, they can design a broader and diverse offering of models that can provide higher capacities. So here's an example of a machine where typically that would have been a 500-pound rated capacity. They can go to 600 pounds, could have been 750 to go to 1,000 pounds. So you're going to be able to get greater capacities as a byproduct of these changes. So while at one level somebody can complain that we have load sensing on this and it's going to cause me a problem, the issue is that it's going to provide also some other benefits such as the increased capacity. There are other elements that have also changed within the design standard. The use of chain gates is eliminated and a tow board will be additionally required in the platform entrance areas. So an increased level of safety, but if someone was going, oh, this was easy to get in and out of with the chain gates, and now you're adding more weight, more cost to the system. These are some of the enhancements that are going to be taking place, and you'll see. MEWPs may be designed for indoor use only. So wind loads do not need to be taken into consideration in design and shall be clearly marked in an easily visible place. The dynamic of this is now you're going to have two aerial work platforms that look identical to one another. One has less counterweight on it. It could be narrower. And if you put that in your rental fleet, you need to make sure that that only goes out in indoor applications. Indoor applications also needs to be understood as something that means that there is no accessibility to wind loads. So if you take a aerial work platform, a scissor lift, and you put it on the 13th floor of a building that's going up and the exterior walls are exposed, they're exposed to wind, and you can't use an indoor machine. So you have to have that understanding that there's no accessibility to wind for that type of equipment. On the opposing side, if you're using it and doing maintenance of a building like this, you have a machine that can be lighter and less expensive, so there are benefits to it, but you need to manage that appropriately. Wind load is changed from a safety factor-based stability and calculation to stability and calculation that includes wind load formulas, increasing the impact of wind forces in the design. The impact with boom-type lifts can be increased in the requirement for the machine's weight and have more restrictions of what size material can be placed in the platform. So as these design criteria are coming over, as I said, these are going to be some of the impacts that are going to come down onto those people who are using it. The ability to design indoor machines only is an example of some of those benefits, but as I said, you need to manage that more effectively. Group A or vertical type platform lifts may be designed with either a fall restraint or a fall arrest anchorage. So a fall restraint anchorage shall be positioned no more than 750 millimeters above the floor and the work platform and has a design of a static load of 3 kilonewtons versus 16 kilonewtons for a fall arrest anchorage. So while you can put them on there, you need to make sure that you're not going to put a fall arrest system on the connection of a fall restraint anchorage. So while, and most times you're going to find those are going to be on a very small platform, but again, you need to make sure that you have the right fall protection system for that anchorage. On any design issues that impact safe use must be incorporated into training or familiarization as appropriate. The introduction of indoor only as an example is the knowledge that an operator must be aware of and the impacts of that. So that kind of gives you a summary of some of the impacts of the design standard. Now we'll go into the safe use standard, which there are some significant changes as well. The CSA B354 standard is an adoption with the Canadian deviations, as I stated earlier. It's the ISO 18893 standard, and the A92 standard is, as you see in front of you, A92.22. The prior standards were structured with responsibilities for each entity, and the new standards, as I stated earlier, are structured by task. The new definitions for all entities when acting in the capacity of another entity will assume the responsibilities of that entity. It sounds like a tongue twister, but fundamentally what it's saying is if I'm a manufacturer and I'm going to let my workers operate that machine, I'm now a user of that equipment, and I need to make sure that I comply with all of the responsibilities of a user. So I'm a manufacturer and a user. And if I also get on the machine and I operate it, I have the responsibilities of an operator. So it's one that if you think about it as a contractor is thought of as a user. He's going to rent this machine, but he could own the machine. And, and then there are other responsibilities that come with that. ANSI's introduced the new term operation manuals, which includes all manuals provided and stored in the weatherproof storage on the MEWP that are considered integral components of the MEWP. ANSI design standard names the operator's manual, so again, operations manuals, and the operations manual is an operator's manual, and the manual responsibility at a minimum to be included on all mobile elevated work platforms. Canada does not have a manual responsibility, and the term is less important, but could also include other documents like an AEM safety manual or manuals for accessories. So anything that the manufacturer supplies and is in that weatherproof compartment now must be stored and maintained on that machine for its life. A specific change in responsibilities that service and parts manuals are required to be provided upon sale of a MEWP versus should be provided with ANSI and CS, within the ANSI standards, and it's silent in the Canadian standards on that. So again, you're looking at that as, you know, I go back to that. There's a change in responsibilities. A change in the word should to shall makes it a recommendation versus a mandatory requirement. So if you don't pick up on that, now, and when you sell it, you must provide those. Manufacturer safety bulletins have been referenced in the existing standards as to comply with, but not necessarily specifically stated within the new standards requiring safety bulletins to address frequent and annual inspections. So if you're doing a frequent or annual inspection and you are not registered with the manufacturer and you're not looking up at the safety bulletins, you have not done a complete compliant annual or frequent inspection. And these are important documents, and it reinforces the requirement to have that registered with the manufacturer. It's now the owner's responsibility to ensure that they are registered with the manufacturer. It's no longer the responsibility of the seller. So the new owner cannot comply with the safety bulletins as required in inspections if they don't register it. Familiarization, for those of you who are out there, as I said, you get training, and training is general on all types of equipment. Familiarization is unit specific. So what's unique about this? For those who aren't familiar with the term, it's really like you going out and renting a car. You're renting a car and you have a driver's license, but you pull out of the rental car lot and it just happens to be raining and it's dark out, and you try to find where the light switch is and where the windshield wipers are, and you can't find them on that particular machine. It's like, you know, you're driving, it's like, that's the wrong time as you're driving out and it's raining and it's dark out to try to find where the controls are. Very similar to a mobile elevated work platform where the controls are different from machine to machine. The functionality and characteristics can be different on these machines. And it really has been important upon them to put that information now clearly in a section within the operator's manual so that everyone can have access to that more easily. Because it's oftentimes that a machine would go out to a job site, and while you could familiarize one operator with it, the operators can change over time on that machine, and having accessibility to that information on the machine is a critical safety element. While not new in the Canadian standards, special inspections shall be required to verify the structural integrity of critical components of the MEWP and its stability as originally manufactured. Again, while this is not specifically stated in the ANSI standards, ongoing inspections to include frequent annual inspections may at any time require a structural inspection as defined by the manufacturer. So it's specific that every 10 years it must be done within the Canadian markets, and it's thought to be something that an inspection should take care of within the ANSI standards. So maintenance and repair training. While ANSI defines specific entities as responsible to ensure maintenance and repair personnel are trained, CSA is equivalent with the broad requirement for maintenance personnel to be trained, which includes an entity performing any maintenance. And that maintenance can be done by an operator, so the scope of what the maintenance is can vary versus a service technician. And regardless of what their required maintenance is, they must be properly trained to comply with that requirement. New language only in the CSA standards places a responsibility on the owner when a MEWP is rented to make arrangements to who is going to perform what inspections and maintenance defined within the section. While not trying to interpret the standard, this may address MEWPs on long-term rentals or MEWPs in areas not accessible to the owner that may still meet the required inspection. So again, it's a new language, it's a new responsibility, and it puts that responsibility on a rental company to ensure that those inspections are done. Modifications, which is a change to the MEWP that affects the operation, stability, safety factors, loads, or safety of the equipment in any way. This picture identifies the issue in the field to allow unapproved modifications that take place and put workers at risk. A92.22, the US standard, states now that only the owner of a MEWP can authorize any modification to a MEWP, not a user, and adds language that the user shall ensure that the MEWP supervisors and operators are aware and comply with this requirement that only the MEWP operator can authorize a modification to a MEWP. So again, this communication is out there trying to prevent some of these things from taking place that are honestly just too commonplace in the marketplace. So the responsibility to communicate that is out in place. Unchanged is the requirement for any modification to be made only if it has the prior written approval of the original manufacturer or its successor. Additional language is provided in the event that the manufacturer is no longer in business, with ANSI requiring that the modification to a MEWP shall be made under the direction of an engineer with expertise in MEWPs. So again, looking at these modifications and trying to control that on something that we don't want to have done because it can impact the stability and many other factors of the machines, must be done by either the manufacturer or an engineer. This is a new section on safe use planning, and it requires a plan that increases prior for the use to prepare of the tasks that include a risk assessment, the selection of the proper MEWP for the application, site preparation for where the MEWP is going to be used. It also introduces the user requirement for a trained and qualified supervisor, the selection, provision, and use of a suitable MEWP, the access, preparation, and maintenance of the site as required. So again, when you're looking at it, we're saying much more planning needs to go into the equipment besides saying one day I need to get up in the air, let me go call someone and send something out. There's a risk assessment that is going to be required on it, which is pretty detailed. Both the standards introduce this new section and the requirements for a risk assessment to be carried out by a MEWP user. Both training standards require compliance with the safe use standard and knowledge of the risk assessment by operators and occupants. Any use, including training, require a risk assessment, and the operator training must include a site risk assessment. So anytime someone's going to get on an area work platform and you start with the foundation, the first time they're going to get on that machine, it's in training. Training is going to model it, so a risk assessment needs to be done in place, and any time after that. So they are going to be trained on the necessity for a risk assessment to take place and its value for them in the operation of it. So, and the complexity of any risk assessment depends upon the task and the hazards associated with it. The risk assessment must also include a rescue plan. It's important to note that while not stated in the standard, best practices require a rescue plan to be practiced. Implementing for the first time the day of an accident is not the appropriate time to try to put in place your plan. So again, a rescue plan is part of that risk assessment and another requirement within the standards. Anytime you're up in the air, as you've seen some of those elements, you have the opportunity to fall. Tony?
Tony, just real quick, you said that's the user, right?
I didn't hear you, Tom.
It's the user, right, under 2.2?
Yes, it's the user.
Right? Okay.
New language addressing training, so now going safe use training requirements. So within the safe use standard, there's language in there that says that training, while the user must ensure that personnel selected to be a MEWP operator are physically and mentally capable to perform the task, and CSA actually adds visual and auditory ability. So again, when you're selecting someone who's going to get on this equipment, it is the user's responsibility to make sure that they're physically and mentally fit to do the job. ANSI requires users to ensure that the operator provides occupant knowledge as defined in the training standard, and also ensure that personnel that directly supervise MEWP operators are trained as defined in the A92.24 training standard. CSA does not mention either in the safe use standard, but does have the same requirement for operator knowledge in the training standard. But there is no requirement for supervisor training in the Canadian standards. So it's a new requirement within the ANSI US standards, not a requirement in the Canadian standards. Operator conformance evaluations are superficially stated. ANSI, as the user assesses if personnel are qualified to perform the task, shall designate a qualified person to monitor, supervise, and evaluate operators on a regular basis to ensure their proficiency. CSA says that periodic on-the-job operator evaluations to ensure conformance with the standard. ANSI additionally has that the evaluations will be accompanied through visual observation at a minimum, and which shall be documented for retention by the user. So again, these observations have to be done on a timely basis, and they now need to be documented by the user. And think about this in the broader sense. If you're a rental company providing the equipment, you have users, the same responsibility goes on your plate for making sure that they're using this equipment safely, and it needs to be documented. Retraining now provides new examples when retraining would be, as stated in the ANSI standards, and may be in the Canadian standards, to include expiration of the operator's valid training period, deterioration of the operator's performance, the operator's extended period of time with no operation of the MEWP, the operator's introduction to new and significantly different MEWP technology, and the operator has been involved in an accident or near miss. So any of those elements now, as they're listed in here, and again, I'm going to go back to the language that states in there, is within the ANSI standards, again, would be, retraining would be, and again, I look at it, and as chairman of this, I'd go over, that's a new term, so we always have should be and shall be, and now we have would be, and that's one of those terms that I would go over and say needs to be reevaluated, but I would define that as a shall be if you in that particular case. Retraining was previously required if necessary based on the user's observation and evaluation of the operator. So that was the exclusive language in the current standards, which was only based on the evaluation of the user. You can now see that there's new language that has multiple examples that should be considered. The new language equals examples of situations when retraining would be necessary versus maybe. So again, these are important changes on retraining as well. Further, the ANSI language that the evaluations, again, should be accomplished through visual observations at a minimum, which will be documented. In prior standards, wind and weather were mentioned once in the standard as one of 10 possible hazards to inspect during your daily workplace inspection. So if you did a word search and said, give me wind and weather, it just said workplace inspection, check for wind and weather. The new standards offer detailed specific information to consider for both risk assessment, use, and training involving all types of weather. So the effects of wind forces, wind on equipment, local wind effects, use in thunderstorms, going into more detail on general ground conditions, subsurface voids. So there's much more meat to the bone to ensure that people are addressing those items, because these are the types of elements that are potential hazards that result in tip overs, which is one of our leading causes of incidents within the aerial industry. Transporting and traveling on public roads. This new language has been added to address common uses of MEWPs on public roads and suggested safety measures to guard against potential hazards in this work area. One of the things that you want to be aware of between the two standards within the US and Canada is that the US standards has all brought in the underbridge inspection aerial devices. So those machines, which are dominantly going to be on the road to work on bridges, increase our focus on road type work, but it also introduces that potential hazard that's out there anytime a MEWP is used on any type of road condition. The prior standards, all applicable safety-related work practices intended to prevent electric shock covered by the Code of Federal Regulations 1910.33 shall be defined and explained to the operator by a qualified person. While acceptable, it is known that electrocutions have occurred when operators are performing other tasks, get too close to the energized line, and it's extremely dangerous. The new standards start with a required distance away from energized lines and only closer if qualified personnel allow. So what is the voltage of a line that's out there? How many operators do you think would know how much voltage is in any of the lines that you go out and see going to, outside of this building or going to a home? Most of them have not a clue of what the voltage is. So when you go over and you put a chart over and say, here's the distance that's out there, and you have an unskilled guy who may be exposed to it, wasn't planning on working here, drives it around to the back of the building, and there's an electric line, now we end up having this potential hazard in place. The new standards say stay a minimum of 10 feet away. So it really is our way of trying to get improved communications to unskilled people in specific areas that we know have potential hazards exposed to them. Ventilation, this again is new language in the standard, and it's a known potential hazard, just as required with battery charging and refueling. Internal combustion engines must be used in a well-ventilated workplace. CO2 poisoning can occur when an internal combustion engine is used in an enclosed area without proper ventilation. So this is a new requirement that's specifically stated in there. Obviously, you should have been doing this even if it's not listed within the standards, but this is our way of identifying items that have occurred within our marketplace that we now have introduced as a specific requirement within the standard. There are two new requirements in the standard addressing entanglement. ANSI is the user shall avoid those applications if possible, and operators shall take precautions to avoid entanglement during operation. CSA says that particular care shall be taken to prevent striking or interfering with the MEWP controls. So again, we're getting to the point where we're identifying hazards that have taken place in our marketplace, and language has been included to address those items. One of the more concerning elements that is in the marketplace is the common use of people exiting an elevated work platform. So while exiting an elevated platform from height can be done safely, it can also be done improperly and place workers at risk. Manufacturer approval will be offered to give clear guidance on how to safely perform the task. Note that the manufacturers have already designed added means to protect workers with anchorages outside the work platform. So you can see examples of improper use that is being done today and means of doing it properly now that the standards are opening the door and trying to make sure that we recognize that people are doing this. Let's make sure that they can do it more safely by providing some very specific guidance on how to address those. So there's very defined requirements within the standard that I won't bore you with the details. You can read those, but it allows you to now exit an elevated work platform under that open guidance, and most of the manufacturers have recognized the fact that this is a needed element and they need to provide better guidance on how to do it safely. And again, by silence on the other side of it is how not to put yourself at risk by not following those guidances. The training center, where we're coming to the close here, commonly referred to as the training standard, which is mobile elevated work platform operator driver training, is in both US and Canada. And with the introduction of a standalone training standard, there are details provided on the method and guidelines to prepare MEWP training materials, administrative criteria, and elements required for proper training and familiarization. Training will be required for different MEWP classifications. For each classification shall be identified with a group and a type, such as the 1A, 1B, 3A, 3Bs that we went over earlier. And theory or classroom training can be offered through a qualified trainer instructor or newly stated online courses. An extensive list of content required to be included in the theory training is provided within the standards. So now you have a very clear guidance of those elements that must be included within the theory course. Separate, in our previous standards, it's pretty much said that each trainee shall operate the equipment for a sufficient period of time under the supervision of a qualified person to demonstrate proficiency in the actual operation of the equipment. How is that manifested within the field? And the real issue is now we have a practical training requirement where each trainee is required to operate it, and a definition and examples within that of how you can monitor and document that. OSHA has been very proactive on the issue of employer training obligations to ensure that the information is being presented in a manner that the recipient is capable of understanding. OSHA issued a policy statement that states in practical terms that instructions must use both language and vocabulary that the employees can understand. The ANSI training standard adopted this OSHA requirement in the standard to make this issue a clear responsibility. You cannot have an employee who cannot adequately understand English attending training delivered in another language. So expect that the training will be effective. So if you're going to train, if someone speaks Spanish and you're going to train them in English, you can't expect that they're going to understand that. You also have to understand that their ability to read and write, because if we're going to go out there and have them read the test and they can't read and they can't fill out the form, all those elements are going to be considered within the training program. So again, it is the employer's obligation or user in ANSI terminology to ensure that the training provided internally or externally is such that the trainee can understand. CSA has added language. It is the user's obligation to provide a translator when required during training to ensure that the worker understands the training as defined in the standard. So again, any training that's going to be delivered must be delivered in a manner that it understands. And again, as I've mentioned to you, applying this in all of the applications of any other products that you're training, this requirement is there for OSHA, and it just is, again, stipulated within our standards. We've now introduced occupant knowledge as a requirement within the standard. Occupants are any person who's in the platform in addition to the operator. And the knowledge that every occupant must have shall include at a minimum the requirements for to use fall protection and the location of fall protection anchors, factors including how their actions could affect stability, safe use of MEWP accessories they are assigned to use, site-specific procedures the occupant must follow related to the operation of the MEWP, hazards related to the task at hand and their avoidance, general knowledge of the intended purpose and function of the MEWP controls and safety-related items specified by the manufacturer, manufacturer warnings and instructions. And the requirements of the last one, which is to get someone down and operate the machine, is really not the intent to make an occupant an operator. The intent is only in the case of an emergency where the operator becomes incapacitated, that at least an occupant knows how to fundamentally get the machine down to a lower position in a rescue situation. So again, that's part of a rescue plan as well. So regardless if the task is simple or complex, performing the task safely and efficiently requires qualified persons to plan and implement the work. The employer has the ultimate responsibilities for employee safety. Tasks are assigned to individuals from operators to service technicians to supervisors to implement safety. Supervisors are considered to be the competent person and authority on the site. They require subject matter knowledge to make informed decisions. MEWP operations may be very basic and simple or complex and laden with risk. While the ANSI standards have introduced specific language that requires supervisory training, the CSA standard has equal responsibilities for users, and someone within the user's company must be qualified, and for me that would still apply to supervisory training. Both ANSI and CSA provide annexes within the standards for knowledge and evaluation and practical evaluation, MEWP operator cards, and authorization operate cards as informative items. So they're examples of how you can document doing knowledge evaluation, practical evaluations, providing a card saying that they have been properly trained. New in the ANSI standard is a requirement that theory, online classroom training, and practical hands-on training evaluations to be documented, and CSA requires proof of theory training and practical training using the annexes as examples. So documentation obviously is going to be a requirement for both of the standards. When you visit the IPATH website, you can obtain some valuable resources, particularly under the Publications and Films tabs and Resources tab. Under the Resource tab, you'll see technical guidance notes that include a white paper, which is IPATH's new ANSI and CSA standards key changes on compliance. So if you go to that website location, you can actually get a white paper that provides a detailed list of all of those changes that we've been reviewing today. So that kind of gives you a quick summary of all the lovely changes that are taking place. I wish that was a little bit more involved with getting you interactive with this presentation, but this is about giving you details of the changes that were taking place. So thank you, be safe, be prepared, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. No questions? Sayonara, thanks. Oh, you have a question? Is to have a qualified person? Or? Well, again, think about the terms. When you're looking at the ANSI standards, we do not typically use, or CSA standards, we typically don't use the word competent person. So competent person is normally thought of within the realm of OSHA regulations, and a competent person is not just someone who's qualified, but also has the authority to make decisions. So that's what makes them competent. All right, and by that definition. Qualified just means that they have the knowledge to do things. So within this scope of what this standard is saying is we're saying if you're going to be supervising a MEWP operator and being able to do the evaluations and documentation to define them, you need to be qualified to perform that task. So really all we're putting in place within the confines of this standard is what are the qualifications that they need to comply with our standard, as opposed to being competent and providing the authority, because that comes from OSHA. It is not a requirement within, or it doesn't have to be a requirement within our standard. Well, qualified, I mean, it is a standard definition in the marketplace. If you read it, but competent is not part of qualified, and qualified or competent includes being qualified. But competent means you also have the authority to stop things and spend money. Any other questions? All right, thank you all.